This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight at the Aram Public Library. With us is the wonderful author, Susan Gloss, who is going to be talking about her writing process and how she researches her backgrounds and where her characters go and travel to. So take it away, Susan.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm here in front of the fire because it's a little bit of a chilly night, so it's a good night to talk about the places that books take us and how different locales, whether they're places I've been to or places I've never been, how they made their way into my books, and some of the joys and challenges of doing the research for both my first book, Vintage, and my second book, The Curiosities. Just a little background about me before I talk about the topic, which is the worlds that books take us to. So I am from Wisconsin and have lived in Wisconsin most of my life. Lived some other places as well. I suppose the furthest off place I've lived was in Spain when I was in college. I spent a semester there. And I have done some traveling, more of it in my pre-children years. But still trying to get out when I can, although the pandemic has definitely put a bit of a damper on travel. But I've always been interested in other cultures, the ways that other people live, and books for me, especially, before I had the opportunity to go, to other countries, books were always my way of accessing parts of the world that I didn't know. So that's just a little bit about me. I grew up in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and I currently live in Madison. I have two young boys, elementary school age boys, and when I am not writing or parenting those small boys, I am a lawyer for the state court system. So I wear a lot of different hats, and writing has always been a passion of mine, and something that I really enjoy. So so just to give a little bit of background, I'm not sure how many who are here in attendance tonight have read my books, but both of them are set in Wisconsin. They're actually both set in Madison. Vintage is about it's about a fictional vintage clothing store in Madison, and the stories behind the items, the clothing that come in and out of the shop, and the women who work there and meet there, and about their lives and how all those stories intertwine. And then The Curiosities is it's a standalone novel. It's considered a companion novel to Vintage because there are some characters that are the same. The main character in The Curiosities, Betsy Barrett, was a minor character in Vintage, and I shouldn't say she's the main character because she's actually deceased, but the Curiosities takes place in an artist colony, a fictional artist colony in Madison, and it's run out of the mansion of Betsy Barrett, who was in the first book, Vintage. She is a secondary character who's also a philanthropist and leaves her fortune to support artists through an artist colony run out of her beautiful old home. So like I said, both of my novels are set in Madison, so I didn't have to go far for inspiration for the scenes that are there. However, both books do go to other places, a lot of it through flashbacks of the characters. Both novels are an ensemble cast, so they're told from multiple points of view. And Vintage, the furthest place that Vintage travels, I suppose you could say, for the reader, is India. One of the main characters in Vintage is a woman named Amithi, who came to the United States at age 19 with her husband. She immigrated from India and raised her family here. And then when her daughter leaves home and, she has some challenges with her husband and their relationship, and she has this sort of identity crisis that I think a lot of people go through whenever they go through a life transition. And so we, through her beautiful saris and jewelry that she brings into the Vintage shop, because she's mad at her husband. I won't spoil anything if you haven't read the book, but she's mad. And so she's getting rid of some of the artifacts of her life. She, through her, the memories that we explore with her, we go back to her youth in India, and we get to see her when she was when she first met her husband in an arranged marriage. And we travel to Jaipur, which is where she grew up, and through her eyes, we get to explore beautiful old palaces and some of the history and the sights and sounds and smells of her youth in India. Now, I've never been to India, and I actually really, when I was writing Vintage, I had this story in mind. I had Amithi's story in mind, and she's one of three main characters. The others are the shop owner, Violet, who lives in Madison, and she's like in her 30s. And at the time I was writing it, I think she's definitely not me, but she was the character who I could relate to the most. And then the other main character is a 18-year-old named April, who interns at the shop. And definitely Amithi's character was the one who was the hardest for me to write, but her story was inspired by hearing stories from a couple of different friends of mine who their parents came over as young married couples, and had to start a whole new life here in the United States, immigrating from India. And I really struggled at first about writing her character, because I thought, I want to make sure that I do it in a way that's authentic and respectful, because I have a lot of admiration and respect for Indian culture. And I wanted to make sure that I got the details right. And I was very aware of the fact that I was, a white girl from Wisconsin writing the story of a 60-ish 60-ish year old woman, who immigrated here. So I definitely was aware that, this was not coming from anything that I experienced, but I also thought that, fiction, if we only ever wrote about our own experiences, then our books, we wouldn't have very much creative leeway. And, it's kind of a silly comparison, but J.K. Rowling was never a wizard, as far as we know. So people make up all kinds of stories, and they're inspired by real life events or just, out of thin air. So So once I decided that I was going to write this character, Amithi, who kept sort of, her story was just kept coming into my head, and it just was clear to me that this character really wanted to be a part of the story. Then I really got into research, and I did my own research about the places and specifically clothing and accessories, since that comes into the book. That was a big part of the research for me. But then I also had a couple of early readers of the manuscript. One of them was a friend of mine who's Indian American and was actually living in India at the time that I was writing the book. And so she was one of my early readers. My friend's mother was also one of my early readers, just to make sure that I had some of the details right and that I wasn't getting something wrong or inadvertently offending anyone. Or it was really important to me that I didn't, because my intention was to tell a story that was as authentic as possible, you know. And so I enlisted the help of some friends who had more familiarity than I did with the places and culture. And so that was really fun. One thing that was kind of cool when the narrator was reading the audiobook for Vintage, when she was recording it, she had questions about some of the names and some of the words that were in the book. And when she asked me, I said, I think this is what it is, but I want to make sure. So she actually exchanged voice messages with my friend who was living in India at the time. And she would say, is this right? And then my friend would leave the narrator a voice message with pronunciations. So I thought that was really cool. And I actually really, it made me really happy that that was the person who had been chosen to record my book, because it made me feel like she really cared, and she also wanted to get things right. And since that was something that was important to me, I really liked seeing that, you know, the person who was reading the audiobook was as interested as I was in getting things right. So so that's a little bit about my process and, you know, some of the research details from Vintage. The Curiosities goes actually, and you're going to hear my kid and one of my kids and maybe my dog in the background because they're downstairs. With the Curiosities, one thing that was really fun about writing the Curiosities was that Betsy Barrett, this character who left her estate in trust to establish an artist colony, her house is filled with art and artifacts from all over the world, because in the story, her husband is a business person who travels frequently, and she goes along with him. And in fact, one of the early working titles of the novel was Artifacts, but we ended up not going with that for the final title. But that was a big part of the Curiosities, is, you know, seeing Betsy's life through the items that she's collected in her life. For example, there's a scene in the book where where her husband actually, before they're married, they traveled together to India, which that would have been probably a big deal back then, because I think this probably would have been, I don't have my spreadsheet timeline in front of me like I did when I was writing it, but based on all the ages of the characters and when events happened, I actually had a spreadsheet showing exactly what years things would have been. But I want to say that when she in the book, when she goes to Italy with her husband, it's in the 50s. And so, you know, it was kind of like, oh, what is she thought, oh, well, my mother's not going to approve of this. What are people going to think that I'm not married and I'm going on this trip? But she goes and so we were with her. Did someone have a question?
Yep.
Registration stations will be drive-through for the next start COVID.
Sorry, I'm hearing kind of some background noise. I'm wondering if someone had a question.
It's a lot of statistics in there. I kind of went, eh.
A lot of what?
Statistics.
Yeah.
I kind of went, eh.
Hi. Hello, everybody. Can you put your sound on mute so that Julie's not getting all the back?
I just looked at it and I'm not interested. I've had it forever.
Okay, I think we're maybe getting some
Yeah,
feedback from somebody. I just wanted to make sure if there was a question. If anyone has a question while I'm talking, please feel free to either unmute yourself or you can do the little raise hand thing on Zoom, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I certainly, I enjoy, having dialogues with readers. So if you have a question, please feel free to interrupt me. But what I was saying was that there's a scene that was really fun to write with Betsy and her, at the time, her boyfriend, but who becomes her husband, when they're in Venice. And I went to Venice years ago, like in my 20s when I was studying abroad. But certainly, I only did, sort of the main, touristy things there. And I definitely remembered some things in my head, but I got to go in and look back at some of the places I had seen and also weave in, artwork and locations. And that was really fun to do, to write that scene. And I can still see the scene very vividly in my head, of Betsy and her husband walking these tiny little pathways along canals in Venice and, over the bridges. And so that was really a lot of fun to research that. And then, there's a scene where she goes to Tokyo to meet with a business contact and of her husband's and his wife. And, they're in this like tower, high-rise penthouse and talking about fashion. And I've never been to Tokyo, but it's certainly somewhere I want to go. And so again, I delved into the research and looked at, what at this time period, and in this situation, it was the scene takes place in the 90s. So I went back and, just based on a few things I knew about 90s fashion coming out of Japan, it was a really big time. It was definitely a sort of a really a time when like Japanese, their styles, I feel like were really making it onto the world, onto the world stage. And so it was fun to go in and, research designers like Yamamoto and weave those into the story through Betsy. And it's also fun to write a character who has like unlimited funds because she, there's really no limit in terms of what, where she would go and of course the things she would wear. So that was a lot of fun to research and write. One big resource that I used when I was writing both books, for the clothing and the fashion, I used the Met. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York has a fantastic costume archive that is online, and they have going back till ancient times, some of the pieces they have. But you can research by dates and places of origin. And I actually had to be really careful when I was researching that I didn't just go down a rabbit hole of looking at pretty things from hundreds of years ago or decades ago, and losing sight of the story and the plot, because it was a lot of fun to go through and do the research on the fashion for both books, and then for the curiosities also the art. My mom, who's actually on the call, hi Mom. She always took my brothers and I to a lot of art museums when we were growing up, and she volunteered at my school doing art appreciation. So she'd come in with slides and talk about a different artwork. And so I grew up having an appreciation for art, and then for the curiosities, researching different artwork that was fun. It was also a little bit tricky because some of the artists, a lot of the artists that are mentioned in the curiosities are real artists. But then, and I'm so literal and I'm so fact oriented that if I was going to describe a painting by, say, George O'Keeffe or, Frank Stella, I wanted to describe something that was very close to a real work of art, but I didn't want to use an actual work of art because then that work of art wouldn't really be in Betsy's home. And I know that other stories and other authors do use, and movies even use real works of art, and you'll see them. But for whatever reason, I didn't want it to be a specific work of art that people already know and would say, oh no, that's not in this person's house. That's hanging at the Chicago Art Institute, or, so I did a lot of research where I would find a piece of art that I thought was very close to what I was wanting to be a part of the story, but then making it a little bit different so that I could tailor it specifically to that character, or how they might have, how Betsy might have acquired it, or what it meant to her. And so I took some liberties there. And there's actually even, there's a couple of Wisconsin artists in there as well. I mentioned Dr. Evermore, who's like a metal sculpt. He does metal sculpture, and he's got all these really interesting, quirky sort of sculptures made out of found objects. And you'll see them around Madison, but also he has, I forget where it is. It's somewhere in like the Driftless area west of Madison, where he has a big sort of sculpture garden, I guess, where you can go and see his work. And so, it was, I sort of walked this fine line between having as much from the factual, real art world, but also not tying it so closely that someone might come into the story with their own knowledge of the history of an artist or painting or work, and that might, because I didn't want anything to get in the way of what the characters' stories were. Because at the end of the day, as much as I love to research, places, artwork and fashion and all the things that make appearances in my stories, at the end of the day, it's really about the characters and the plot, and what's going on in their lives, and what their problems are, and how they get resolved, and how they change as characters. So, but as someone who's kind of a research nerd who loves delving into that, sometimes I had to kind of pull myself back a little bit and actually give myself a limit. Like, okay, I'm getting a little too deep into this. I'm not sure that the readers are gonna think that this is relevant to the story as much as I might think it's interesting. So, excuse excuse me. I'm just gonna pull up here. I did see that there were a couple things in the chat, and I just wanted to see if there were any questions. Doesn't look like there are, but
I'll let you know too.
about anything
I'll
I
let you
said?
know too. I'll let you know too if I see something that there's a question that you might not have seen.
Okay, thank you so much. So I was actually going to ask a question about the libraries. From what I understand, it's this is like a theme of travel, like books, and as a sort of a gateway to the world or to travel. Do I understand that right? That's like a theme that you guys are.
Yep, that is true, Susan. So right now we're doing, we've had a couple of live tours in Costa Rica, one of a coffee plantation, and then we have one of a volcano at the end of the month. So that'll be, we're having people attend either via Zoom if they don't want to come into the library, or they can attend and watch it here in the library. And then sprinkled forward, I'm actually going to Italy in April, so I hope to do a little armchair travel event in May. So yeah, we are trying to, get beyond our boundaries, I guess.
Yeah. I love that. I love that idea so much, because I do think that reading is such a great way to learn about the world. But I also love that it's happening now, because I do feel like it's a time when, I think people are starting to travel again, but it's a time when a lot of travel has been put on pause. And so I think it's really cool that you're bringing it to people so that, they don't have to leave home and still get a glimpse of the world. So that's really cool. So I feel like I've given a little bit of an overview of sort of some of the places that are touched on in the books. Does anyone have any questions about like process or just writing in general, that sort of thing? I feel like that's something that often comes up when I talk with readers. All right, well, if no one has any specific questions, I'll just kind of launch into what are some of your favorite vintage shops? Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So in Madison, we have Good Style Shop on Johnson Street, which is, it's been there at least a decade now, but it used to be up on the corner where the AC Hotel is in Madison now, but it's like, it used to be at like East Wash, and I think it's Webster. But anyway, that shop is kind of cool because they've got a lot of great stuff in there. But one thing that I think is neat about Good Style Shop is that they used to be on up by the square, and then they moved to Johnson Street. And so when vintage came out, a lot of people, especially locally, like people interviewed me for like, local magazine or newspaper articles. They're like, oh, well, vintage is obviously the store in Vintage, Hourglass Vintage is obviously, it's Good Style Shop, right? Because it's on Johnson Street. And I say it could be, but it actually isn't, because at the time I wrote Vintage, that particular shop was not on Johnson Street. It was up near the Capitol. And so, the fact that they moved there, they actually moved there right around the same time that Vintage came out. So that was really, really fun, because it was not, even though it's not the store in the book, it was a way that, you could picture that, oh, that could be where it would be. I'm really lucky that we have a new vintage shop right in my neighborhood, just a couple blocks away, called Still Goods. They actually opened during the pandemic. the woman who runs it, they just celebrated their 1 year of being open. And I have so much respect and admiration for people who opened up businesses during the pandemic. I know I've talked to a few people locally that have, and I just think it's just so awesome that, in some ways, it's like, well, I've been dreaming of doing this forever, so why not now? So yeah, those are a couple of my favorites here in Madison, and I mean, when I travel, actually, I really like to visit vintage shops when I can, because I think one of my favorite places to visit shops like that is in New Orleans. I mean, there's just so much history there. Okay, so I'm reading some questions here. How did I choose some of the art objects that were highlighted? Okay, yeah. So in the Curiosities, all the chapters begin with an art piece, and some of the pieces are pieces made by the artists, the fictional characters in the book. But then others, some of them are Wisconsin inspired. Like I reference, in the first chapter, I reference a mural by Edwin Blashfield, who actually did a lot of the murals in the state capitol. And I mean, our state capitol building is so incredible and has, just a lot of really amazing artwork. And so the piece that I talk about there, it's one of those situations where I took an actual artist and date, that would have been appropriate for the, when that artist was working, and subject matter, but it's not an actual painting that's in the Capitol. I made up my own, but based on, similar to something you would actually see there. And I tried to feature some artists from Wisconsin, also female artists, maybe that weren't as well known as their male counterparts. Like there's a chapter where Annie, one of the artists who lives at the artist colony, she is when she's a college student, she hitchhikes from her East Coast school to go to a protest, protesting the Miss America pageant. She's a feminist who's attending these protests and doing like performance art, lighting things on fire and that sort of thing. And I had her be really interested in like the women, who were abstract expressionists. Everyone's heard of Jackson Pollock, but what a lot of people don't know is that his wife was, actually broke into that world before he did. And that her, her art, she was very well respected, but people don't always, Pollock is the name that you remember. And Lee Krasner is her name, I believe. It's been so long since I've written the book. It's some of the names blend together, but so I tried to highlight some women artists. Georgia O'Keeffe also is highlighted in the book. She has a Wisconsin connection, grew up in Sun Prairie. So I tried to make some of those connections to Wisconsin where I could, even if it wasn't an artist who was necessarily originally from Wisconsin, but someone who maybe had a touchstone here or, had some sort of connection. So I'm reading another question is, now that I have 2 successful books behind you, is a third on the horizon? Oh, that is a very good question. Okay. And then the next question is also, would you consider writing a book with the character or characters from Vintage or the Curiosities? So those are both good questions. So I had actually started on a third book I have about 50 pages written and a lot of research done on my, in fact, this will be show and tell time. It's kind of fun. This is my office for my third book. And pages from my writing group with notes. So I've workshopped like 50 pages of it with my writing group. I have all my research materials all tabbed up. My timeline. So as you can see, I was well on my way to, it's historical fiction. And it's actually the book that this book that I'd started it's set in 1890s London. And it's told from the perspective, and I'm not going to tell you who it is because maybe if you have really good eyes, maybe you saw the books, but it's the wife of someone who was a very prominent literary figure in both England and was from England, but also was known in the United States at the time. It's historical fiction, so not set in Wisconsin, not set in modern day. But so it was kind of it's something different, from what I've written in the past. Although my first two books go back as early as the 1940s. So they technically are, there are some historical fiction elements, and actually Vintage was reviewed by the Historical Novel Society. So it technically checks some of those boxes of historical fiction, but it's set in the modern day, and both of the books are set in the modern day. So yeah, my next book, my next project that is, it's straight historical fiction. And yeah, I've gotten a start on it, but I have not really written much in recent times because during COVID, I, was not only trying to do my job that I get a regular paycheck for, which is my lawyer job, not only doing that from home, but also overseeing my kids' virtual schooling. My husband and I called it the Parsons Learning and Dog Training Academy, because we also had a puppy that we came into the pandemic with, the little puppy. So there was not a lot. The sort of thing I was writing was very research intensive, requires sitting down, with a lot of materials. I actually have, so the main character in this historical fiction novel that I've started, she actually, although her husband is the one who's very well known, she actually published a few books too. And I had to do library loan, I had to go into academic library databases to get my hands on these books because they're really rare. They're not, they didn't have a huge print run, and they're sort of, they're hard to get your hands on. So I got my hands on one for a short amount of time, and then I PDF'd all the pages so that because I had to give it back because it's, a rare book. And so I have those that I can look through. But yeah, that sort of very sort of scholarly work, I guess, is not so conducive to having a house full of people when you're on lockdown. So finally, life is starting to get back to a point where I feel like I could pick that up again, but I'm not quite there yet. So, but it is a project I'm excited about, and I do have a good start on it, and my agent knows about it, and she's excited about the idea. But it's a hard time to sell a book right now too. So I'm not terribly sad to not have something on submission, because the authors I know who do have books that they're shopping around, it's a hard time to sell a book right now because, the state of the world is a bit of a mess. So So I'm happy to have my research started, and I'll pick it back up as as we all kind of come up for air. Would I be traveling to London to do research? Yes, and Scotland. I've been to London before, but it was a long time ago. And London is such a wonderful place for people who love literature and history. I mean, it's just, the one time I went there was in my 20s, and I went to the British Library, where they have like Shakespeare's manuscripts. It's incredible. But yes, I will need to go to probably to Scotland as well, because the characters spend a good deal of time in Scotland, and I've never been to Scotland. So that probably is in the future, but again, hasn't been the greatest time to travel to England, but I think we're getting closer to being able to do that again. And then I saw there's also a question here about if I write a book with a character or characters from Vintage or the Curiosities. When I wrote the Curiosities, I felt like from Vintage, the character of Betsy, I felt like she was a character who had, she just had so much potential. She was only a secondary character, but you could just tell that she had this very big and interesting life. And so I felt like her story had not completely been told yet. And so I went, I kind of took off with her story and weaved it into the Curiosities. Although the artists and the main characters that live in the artist colony in the book, they are completely new characters and they were not in Vintage. So in that sense, it's its own story. But I don't know if I will write something again based on the characters from either of those books. I don't know. I guess it depends on whether I feel like there's still questions unanswered or things that I want to explore there. And it's, there are some, both of my books end with questions that are unanswered. In fact, the Curiosities, I had a book blogger tell me that she threw the book across the room because she was so mad. She liked the book, but she was so mad about the ending because it's a very ambiguous ending. And I really enjoy an ambiguous ending because I like for the reader to be able to decide what they think happens. So I easily could tell that if I wanted to in another story, but I'm not sure that I want to, because I kind of like leaving it in the reader's imagination and letting the story take on its own life, once you've read the last page. So yeah, I don't know if I think for me to write about any of these characters again, I'd really have to have something strike me that, that really took me off in a direction where I wanted to delve into something that I hadn't yet. And at this point, I don't see that happening. Although the television and film rights are still available for both of my books. So should anyone ever wish to make, particularly Vintage, I think would make a really great series or film. If that opportunity were to present itself, I would love to be involved in adapting it for a screenplay. And I've actually talked to people about doing that. It's something that's so out of my own wheelhouse, though, that I wouldn't even know where to start. But that is something that I could see taking those characters' stories somewhere else, would be maybe through adapting for screenplay. But no one's knocking on my door for it. But if that opportunity were to come up, that would be certainly something that I think would be really fun.
Okay, so we're about wrapping up here. I want to thank Susan for such a wonderful sharing of the writing process. And I thought it was, if anybody wins the lottery anytime soon, we know who to invest in for our next movie project.
Yep. Or if you know anybody at Netflix,
Does anyone have any other questions that they would like to ask this evening?
Just thank her for doing this.
Yeah, we have a thank you. We have someone here, people here in the library who've been listening, and they said, thank you very much for doing this.
Thank
And,
you so much.
We actually are doing a raffle for Susan's, one of Susan's books. It's the Curiosity Shop, is it? I'm looking at the title. And if you would like to be entered in the raffle, just let me know. I know we have our Zoom audience, and the video from tonight will be launching on our YouTube and Facebook channels, and I will send that link to everyone as well. So if we don't have any other questions, I'm looking at the chat. You've had several thank yous. I think anything else you'd like to add, Susan, before you continue your evening?
I also just want to say thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone who attended and listened. It's always fun to talk with readers.
Well, thank you so much. And I want to just give a shout out to our Denise who set this all up. So thank you, everyone, and thanks for attending. And for those of you who are attending virtually, the library has many virtual programs. So please check out our calendar and our website for further details on any of the upcoming programs. So thank you all.
And I hope to be able to visit the library in person, maybe for my next book.
That would be great. That would be
We'd
great.
love it.
We would love to have you in person.
We're gonna have some treats.
Oh,
All right.
our friend's president is here and she said she'll provide treats.
Oh, well, then I'm there.
That's right. That's right. It's all about food. All right. Well, thank you so much, Susan. And have
Have a good
lovely
night.
evening.
You too.